Rancher saved giant Apache woman from fire. Later on her father came with impossible request. Hello everyone. Before we begin today's story, I have a small favor to ask. Please hit subscribe and turn on the notification bell so you never miss our channel's new videos. It's quick, free, and the best way to support us in bringing you more dramatic stories. Your support means the world to us. Where are you watching from? Drop your city or country in the comments below. Thank you very much. Now let's begin. In the vast, dry expanse of the western frontier, where the sun beats down relentlessly and the wind howls across the barren land, there lived a rancher named James Porter. James was a man of few words, a man of action. His ranch, nestled in a quiet valley far from the bustling towns, had been his refuge for many years. Alone for the most part, he had learned to live with the solitude, finding peace in the endless work of tending to his cattle and repairing his fences. He had no interest in the conflicts of the outside world. He only wanted to maintain his land and live out his days in quiet isolation. But everything changed one fateful evening. It started with the crackling sound of a fire in the distance. The dry, brittle grass that covered the land was the perfect fuel for a fast-spreading blaze. As the fire quickly approached his property, James knew he had little time. His instincts kicked in, and without a second thought, he mounted his horse and rode toward the flames. He could see it now, the towering inferno devouring the land ahead. And there, in the midst of the fire, was a figure, a woman, struggling against the heat and smoke. Without hesitation, James spurred his horse forward, racing toward her. As he reached the edge of the fire, he saw her clearly, an Apache woman, towering and strong, but now helpless, trapped in the flames. The heat was unbearable, the smoke choking him, but James pushed on, diving into the fire to save her. He grabbed her and threw her over the back of his horse, racing away from the inferno as quickly as possible. The fire seemed to roar behind them, but James didn't look back. He focused only on getting her to safety. Once they reached the edge of the property, James dismounted and gently laid her on the ground. The woman, though dazed and burned, was alive. She looked up at him with wide, startled eyes, but her expression quickly shifted from fear to gratitude. She couldn't speak, but the look in her eyes was enough. James had saved her life. As she lay there, recovering from the ordeal, James saw the raw strength in her. She was no helpless victim. She was a warrior, and he knew this encounter would change both their lives. The next morning, as the sun rose over the horizon, James found himself thinking about the woman he had saved. Who was she? Why had she been out there, in the middle of the fire? And what would happen now? Little did he know, this act of kindness would lead to a request that would challenge everything he knew about loyalty, family, and duty. But that story is for later. The woman, though still weak from the fire, sat up slowly, her eyes locking with James as he prepared a makeshift bed for her under the shade of a nearby oak tree. Her clothes were singed, and her skin showed the marks of the flames, but there was a fire in her spirit that seemed to defy the pain. James could feel the weight of her gaze, an unspoken bond between them. He had saved her life, but he could not shake the feeling that this was just the beginning. The woman's lips parted, but the words that followed were barely a whisper, spoken with the strength of someone who had seen too much. "I owe you a debt," she said, her voice raspy but full of resolve. James shook his head, his rough hands brushing against his worn shirt as he knelt beside her. "No need for any debt. I just did what anyone would do." But her eyes narrowed, as if she was not convinced by his words. She gave a small nod before looking down at the ground, her fingers tracing the outline of her pendant, a small piece of turquoise wrapped in silver, which seemed to hold more significance than he could understand. James didn't press her further, knowing that sometimes silence spoke louder than words. The next few days passed in a blur. The woman, whom James learned was called Nehemina, recovered slowly. He tended to her wounds, and in return, she taught him bits and pieces of her culture, her language, and her history. Nehemina was not just any Apache woman. She was the daughter of a powerful chief, someone whose name carried weight and respect among her people. But Nehemina was different from most of the stories James had heard. She wasn't just a warrior. She was a symbol of strength and resilience, a reminder that survival meant something more in this harsh world. It wasn't until the fourth day after the fire that Nehemina's father arrived. The man who stepped onto James' land was tall and imposing, his presence like the weight of a thunderstorm on the horizon. He wore a headdress of feathers, each one marking a victory, a memory of battles fought and won. His eyes, dark and calculating, met James with an intensity that spoke volumes. James stood from where he had been repairing the fence, his heart beating harder in his chest as he approached the man. "You are James Porter," the chief said, his voice low but steady, as if the very ground beneath him responded to his words. James nodded, his hand instinctively resting on the handle of his shovel. "Yes, sir, I am." The chief looked over at his daughter, who had stood silently beside James, her gaze lowered. He saw the marks of the fire on her skin, the pain she had endured. His expression softened for a moment before hardening again. "You saved my daughter," he said, his words deliberate. "And for that, you have my thanks. But there is something more you must do for me." James could feel the weight of the moment pressing down on him, as if the air itself had become thicker with expectation. He had known this was coming, the moment when gratitude would turn into obligation. "Anything," James said, his voice steady despite the rising tension in his chest. The chief's eyes glinted, a faint smile playing at the corners of his lips. "I need you to help us fight a battle," he said, his voice a commanding force. "A battle to protect our people from a threat that grows with each passing day." James felt the world tilt beneath his feet. He had been living in isolation for years, far from the politics and the violence of the world around him. He had no desire to be involved in any battle, especially one that would drag him deeper into the conflicts of the Apache tribe. But as he looked at Nehemia, standing strong despite the scars that marred her skin, he knew that his decision would not just affect his life. It would affect the lives of those he had come to care for. "What kind of battle?" James asked, his voice barely a whisper. The chief's gaze grew even more intense, as if he were measuring James' very soul. "The kind where only strength and courage will see us through," he said. "The kind where men like you are needed, men who know what it means to fight for something worth protecting." James' heart pounded in his chest as he stood there, torn between his desire for peace and the undeniable pull of duty that now called to him. This was not a fight he had ever planned to take on, but as he looked at Nehemia again, the answer seemed clear. James stood silently, the weight of the chief's request hanging heavily in the air. The sounds of the wind and distant cattle seemed to fade as he processed the gravity of the situation. He had spent so many years alone on this land, keeping to himself, avoiding any kind of conflict or trouble. But now, the choice seemed unavoidable. He glanced over at Nehemia, who stood a little behind her father, her face a mixture of concern and quiet resolve. It was clear that her father's request was not just an obligation. It was a test, a trial of sorts. The chief had asked for his help, and with that request, a bond had been formed, whether James was ready for it or not. "What exactly do you need me to do?" James asked, his voice steady but with a hint of uncertainty. The chief's eyes never left James, his gaze unyielding. "There is a land dispute," he said, his voice rough as though the weight of the years had made it so. "There are men who wish to take what is ours. They are armed, ruthless, and they will stop at nothing to take what they believe belongs to them. I need a man like you, someone who understands the land, someone who is not afraid of fighting for what is right." James took a deep breath, looking over at the ranch that had been his home for so many years. The wide, open plains, the rugged mountains in the distance, it was all he had ever known. But now, this land, his land, was in danger. "I don't want trouble," James said, his voice almost a whisper. "I've kept to myself for a long time. I just want to keep my cattle, my ranch, and live quietly." The chief studied him for a long moment, his expression hard but thoughtful. "You have already chosen," he said quietly. "You saved my daughter. You helped her when the fire took everything from her. That is not a small thing. Now, you must choose whether to stand by her, by us, or turn your back on what is right." James felt a shiver run down his spine as the words sank in. He had no intention of turning his back on the woman he had saved, on Nehemia. But the thought of the fight ahead, of standing against men who would stop at nothing, filled him with dread. Still, he knew in his heart that this was no longer just about him. He had become part of something much larger than his quiet life on the ranch. "I'll do what I can," James said, his voice resolute. "But I'm no warrior." The chief nodded. None of us are born warriors. But sometimes, a warrior is made in the heat of battle, and you will not fight alone. Over the next few days, James prepared. He gathered what little he had, a rifle, some ammunition, a few tools, and made the decision to stand with Nehemina and her people. The chief had gone ahead to gather his warriors, but James knew the battle would be long and hard. He had to be ready. The night before the battle, as James sat alone by his fire, Nehemina approached him. She did not speak at first, but instead sat down beside him, the crackling fire casting flickering shadows over her face. She was still quiet, still processing everything, but there was a strength in her that James admired. "You don't have to do this," she said softly. "You've already done more than enough. You saved me. That was enough." James looked at her, his gaze steady. "It's not just about saving you anymore," he said. "It's about doing what's right. I can't just sit back and let these men take everything." Nehemina reached out and placed a hand on his arm, her touch gentle yet firm. "Then we fight together," she said, her voice steady, her words final. The next morning, as the sun rose over the plains, James knew this would be the day that changed everything. He was no longer just a rancher on a quiet piece of land. He was part of something larger, something that would require every ounce of strength and courage he had. The battle for the land, for the future of the Apache people, had begun. The days leading up to the battle felt like a slow march toward an inevitable clash. James had spent his time getting ready, but every moment felt like he was being pulled further away from the quiet life he had once known. The sound of the wind rustling through the trees seemed to carry the weight of the decision he had made. It wasn't just about protecting his land anymore. It was about standing with Nehemina and her people. He knew that the battle they were about to face would be like nothing he had ever known. Nehemina stood beside him, calm and composed, but there was a fire in her eyes that spoke of everything she had fought for. She had been through so much, and now, as the sun began to set on the eve of the fight, James knew this was her fight as much as it was his. The Apache warriors, led by Nehemina's father, had gathered near the edge of the valley, their faces painted for war, their eyes filled with determination. The plan was simple. They would face off against the men who had come to steal their land, men who had been encroaching on Apache territory for years. The warriors had been preparing for days, but the fear and uncertainty of war still hung heavy in the air. James joined the group, standing next to Nehemina and her father. His heart pounded in his chest as he looked around at the assembled warriors. These were people who had lived through the worst of what the world could offer, people who had fought for survival in a land that showed no mercy. He had no illusions about what was to come. The violence would be brutal, the stakes high. And yet, as he stood there, feeling the weight of the moment, James also felt a sense of purpose. He wasn't just a rancher anymore. He wasn't just fighting to protect his land. He was fighting for something bigger, something that could change the future for Nehemina and her people. Nehemina's father turned to him, his voice low but strong. "You don't have to do this," he said. "You've already shown your bravery by standing with us. But if you want to leave, now is your chance." James looked at Nehemina, who met his gaze with a silent intensity. There was no turning back now. "I'm staying," James said firmly. "I made my choice." Nehemina's father gave a small nod of approval. "Then stand with us. Together, we fight. We fight for our land, our people, and our future." The night was quiet, too quiet, as the warriors made their final preparations. The campfire flickered in the breeze, casting long shadows over the landscape. James stood beside Nehemina, the crackling fire the only sound between them. "I don't know what's going to happen tomorrow," James said, his voice rough. "But I know I'm not doing this alone." Nehemina turned to him, her eyes filled with gratitude and something deeper, something that transcended words. She reached out and touched his arm, a silent acknowledgement of the bond they had formed. "You're not alone," she whispered. As the first light of dawn broke over the horizon, the warriors gathered, their horses ready, their weapons sharp. James mounted his horse, the saddle creaking beneath him, and looked out across the land that he had come to know so well. It was a land that had once been his escape, but now it was a battlefield. The time had come. The men who had threatened the Apache people were about to face their reckoning. As the warriors began to move, James felt the adrenaline rush through his veins. This was no longer about survival. This was about standing up for what was right, no matter the cost. The first shots rang out as they approached the enemy camp. The battle had begun, and there was no turning back. James fought alongside Nehemina and her people, his rifle steady in his hands, his aim true. Every shot counted, every movement was calculated. But it wasn't just the weapons that made the difference. It was the strength of the Apache warriors, the unity they had forged through years of struggle and hardship. As the battle raged on, James found himself fighting not just for land, but for a future, for a people who had long been forgotten by the world around them. The enemy was strong, but the Apache were stronger. The battle would be hard, but James knew they would not give up. Together, they would fight, and together, they would win. The battle was chaos. The sounds of gunfire and the cries of warriors filled the air as James and the Apache warriors fought side by side against the encroaching forces. The enemy, though ruthless, lacked the unity and fierce determination of the Apache. James found himself caught in the rhythm of war, the pounding of his heart matching the beat of his boots against the earth as he charged forward, rifle raised. Nehemina fought beside him, her movements swift and graceful, every strike she made purposeful and deadly. Her father, the chief, led the charge, his war cry cutting through the noise like a thunderclap. The Apache warriors followed, an unstoppable force, their weapons flashing in the sunlight as they pushed the enemy back. The battle raged on for hours, with no sign of slowing down. James could feel the tension in the air, thick with the weight of life and death. The sun hung low in the sky, casting long shadows over the battlefield. James had never been in a fight like this, but there was something about the way the Apache fought, something raw and primal, that made him feel as though he belonged. The enemy had underestimated them, believing that their superior numbers would be enough to crush the Apache resistance. But as the day wore on, it became clear that the Apache had something more, a deep, unshakable connection to the land and each other. In the heat of the battle, James found himself side by side with Nehemina once again. She glanced over at him, her face determined, the fire of battle burning in her eyes. "Stay close," she called out to him over the noise. "We finish this together." James nodded, his grip tightening on his rifle. They moved as one, weaving through the chaos, their actions synchronized. Every shot they fired, every move they made, seemed to be part of a greater plan. They weren't just fighting for survival anymore. They were fighting for the future of their people, for the land they loved, and for each other. As the hours passed, the tide began to turn. The enemy, once so confident in their numbers, started to falter. The Apache, fueled by their desire to protect their land, pressed forward, relentless in their assault. James could see it in their eyes. This wasn't just a battle. It was a fight for their very way of life. And they weren't going to lose. The chief, ever the strategist, called for a final push. With a fierce war cry, the Apache warriors surged forward, overwhelming the enemy forces. James and Nehemina were at the front, fighting side by side as the enemy began to retreat. The ground beneath them was littered with the fallen, the remnants of a brutal conflict. But the battle was not over yet. As the enemy scattered, a few stragglers remained, trying to regroup. James was moving toward one of them when he felt a hand on his shoulder. It was Nehemina, her eyes filled with urgency. "No," she said quietly. "We have won this fight. The rest are cowards who will flee. Let them go." James paused, looking at her. The fire in his chest was still burning, the need for victory still strong. But as he looked into Nehemina's eyes, he saw the wisdom in her words. The battle was done. The land had been saved. The Apache had proven that their spirit could not be broken, that they would fight to the end for what was theirs. He nodded, understanding. "We've won," he said softly, more to himself than to her. Nehemina's gaze softened as she placed her hand on his arm, a silent acknowledgement of the bond they had forged in the heat of battle. Together, they had faced the storm, and together, they had emerged victorious. As the Apache warriors began to regroup and care for their wounded, James stood beside Nehemina, his heart still racing from the battle, but now filled with a sense of fulfillment. They had won, and in that victory, James had found something he had been searching for his entire life, a sense of belonging, a place where he could fight for something greater than himself. Nehemina's father approached, his expression one of quiet pride. "You fought well," he said, his voice deep and commanding. You have proven yourself to be more than just a rancher. You are one of us now. James looked at Nehemina, who stood beside him, her face proud but also filled with a quiet relief. She had not only saved him, but she had shown him what it meant to stand for something, to fight for something worth protecting. I will always stand by you, James said, his voice steady and strong. By all of you. The chief gave a solemn nod, then turned to address his people. The battle had been won, but the war was far from over. There was still much to be done. But for now, they had secured their future. And that was a victory worth celebrating. The battle had ended, but the quiet that followed was anything but peaceful. The Apache warriors, though victorious, were left with the heavy task of tending to the wounded, burying the dead, and rebuilding what had been lost. James stood with Nehemina, the smoke from the battlefield still lingering in the air as the sun began to dip below the horizon, casting a warm, golden glow over the land. It was a surreal moment, one where victory and loss seemed to merge into a single, bittersweet memory. Nehemina's father, the chief, had ordered a small ceremony to honor the fallen, both Apache and enemy alike. James stood among the crowd of warriors, his heart heavy with the weight of the lives lost. He had seen the brutality of war up close, but it was the sacrifice of the people around him that weighed on him the most. He had fought beside them, bled with them, and now he was one of them. The chief approached him after the ceremony, his face somber but proud. You fought with honor, James, he said, his voice deep with respect. You have proven yourself not just as a man of the land, but as a man of the tribe. But this victory, though sweet, is just the beginning. Our people are still in danger. James looked at Nehemina, standing beside her father, her eyes filled with a quiet strength. I'm ready, he said, his voice steady. Whatever comes next, I'll stand with you. Nehemina's father nodded. There are those who will not give up easily. The men we fought today are only part of a much larger threat. The battle for our land is far from over. James knew this, but the fire that had burned inside him during the battle still burned strong. He had found a purpose, a reason to fight. It wasn't just about protecting the land. It was about protecting the people who had taken him in, who had fought alongside him. It was about standing up for what was right. Over the next few weeks, the Apache warriors rebuilt their camp, fortified their defenses, and made plans for what was to come. James was there every step of the way, helping where he could, learning the ways of the Apache, and becoming more integrated into their tribe. Nehemina, always by his side, taught him the traditions, the stories, and the customs that had been passed down through generations. They were no longer just allies, they were partners. Their bond had grown stronger with each passing day, and James found himself caring for her in a way that went beyond mere respect. She had shown him what it meant to be strong, to fight not just for survival, but for a greater purpose. As the days turned into weeks, James felt a shift within himself. He was no longer the outsider, the rancher who had stumbled into their world. He was part of it now, bound by more than just a shared struggle. He was bound by a shared future. One evening, as they sat by the fire, Nehemina turned to him, her eyes searching his face as if trying to read the depths of his thoughts. You've changed, she said softly, her voice carrying the weight of the question. You are not the man who came to us all those weeks ago. What do you see when you look at yourself now? James stared into the flames, the crackling fire reflecting the turbulence within him. I see a man who has found his place, he said, his voice low. I see a man who is willing to fight for something that matters. And I see a future, not just for me, but for all of us. Nehemina smiled, a rare and genuine smile that made James' heart race. You are more than just a rancher now, James. You are part of our story, part of our fight. And that is something no one can take away. The words hung in the air between them, a promise, a declaration. And as the night stretched on, James knew that whatever the future held, he would face it with Nehemina by his side. The battle may have ended, but the war was not over. There was more to be done, and James was ready to do it, whatever it took, for the land, for the people, and for the woman he had come to love. Weeks passed, and the air of uncertainty that had once gripped James began to fade. The Apache warriors, under Nehemina's father's leadership, were strengthening their position, preparing for whatever threat might come next. James found himself deeply entrenched in the rhythm of their lives, waking early to help rebuild structures, set traps, and protect their borders. He had learned the ways of the Apache, not just in battle but in their traditions, their songs, and their connection to the land. Nehemina had shown him what it meant to truly live in harmony with the earth, to understand the balance between taking and giving. But despite the progress, there was still a lingering tension in the air, the sense that danger was always close, waiting to strike. One night, as they sat around the fire, the chief called James over. The firelight flickered across the weathered face of the leader, his expression hard, yet there was a quiet respect in his eyes. "James," he began, his voice low but commanding. "You have proven your loyalty, but there are still questions that need answering. We have defeated the men who threatened our land, but there are others. Men who work in the shadows, seeking to destroy us. We need your help to find them before they find us." James looked at Nehemina, sitting nearby, her gaze unwavering. The bond between them had grown stronger in the months since the battle, and now, as he looked at her, he knew he couldn't turn away. "What do you need me to do?" James asked, his voice steady. "I'll do whatever it takes." The chief nodded. "There is a man," he said, his eyes narrowing. "A man who has been watching us, waiting for the right moment to strike. He has been gathering information, working with others in the region who seek to take our land. We need you to find him, to bring him to us, dead or alive." James didn't hesitate. The task was dangerous, but it was one he could not refuse. He had already chosen where his loyalties lay. "I'll find him," James said, his resolve firm. Nehemina stood up, walking over to him. She placed her hand on his arm, her touch warm and reassuring. "Be careful," she said quietly, her voice filled with concern. "This man is not just any enemy. He is a shadow, a ghost who has eluded us for too long. He will not be easy to find." James looked into her eyes, seeing the depth of her worry. He gave her a small, reassuring smile. "I know, but I won't fail you." With that, James set out at dawn the next day. He knew the landscape well, but this mission felt different. It wasn't just a task, it was personal. The man he was hunting wasn't just any enemy. He was someone who threatened the very people James had come to call family. For the next few days, James tracked the man, moving through the rugged terrain, relying on the skills he had learned from Nehemina and the Apache. The land spoke to him now. He could read the signs, follow the faintest tracks, and understand the rhythms of nature in a way he never had before. But no matter how hard he searched, the man remained elusive. It wasn't until the third night, as the moon cast a pale light over the desert, that he finally found what he had been looking for. He was close now, so close he could feel it. The wind had shifted, and the night air was thick with the scent of dust and smoke. James crouched low, his rifle ready in his hands, as he watched the figure emerge from the shadows. It was the man, the one they had been searching for. He moved quickly, his steps deliberate, as though he knew he was being followed. James's heart pounded in his chest as he waited for the right moment. The man stopped, his eyes scanning the darkness. James didn't wait any longer. With a quick, silent motion, he sprang from his hiding place, closing the distance between them. The man turned, but before he could react, James was on him, tackling him to the ground. The two men struggled, but James was strong, and his training with the Apache had made him a force to be reckoned with. He pinned the man down, his rifle trained on him. "It's over," James said, his voice cold, his grip tightening. The man's eyes flashed with anger and fear. "You don't know who you're dealing with," he spat, his voice thick with venom. "You think you've won, but this is just the beginning." James didn't respond. He had heard enough of these threats. He knew what needed to be done. With a swift movement, he disarmed the man, binding his hands tightly with rope. The hunt was over. James had found the enemy, and now he was ready to bring him back to Nehemina and her father. As he began the long journey back, his thoughts turned to the future. The fight was far from over, but James had come to realize something important. He wasn't just fighting for survival anymore. He was fighting for a future, for the land, for the people he had come to love, and for the woman who had shown him what it meant to truly belong. James rode back to the Apache camp with the captured man bound tightly on his horse. The ride was long and silent, the weight of his burden heavy not just in terms of the physical restraint, but the realization of what this man represented. He had threatened everything James had come to value. The Apache people, their land, and the future that he now saw for himself alongside them. When James finally arrived, the camp was calm, the warriors going about their routines, mending their gear, and preparing for what was ahead. Nehemina was standing near the fire, her face slightly illuminated by the soft glow. She turned as she saw James approach, her eyes scanning the bound man before landing on him. Her expression was unreadable, but the quiet respect in her gaze made James feel a weight lift off his shoulders. He had done it. He had kept his promise to her and her people. "You found him," Nehemina said softly, walking toward him. Her voice was steady, but he could hear the emotion beneath it. James nodded, dismounting from his horse. "I did." The chief appeared from the shadows of the camp, his stern face softening when he saw the prisoner. He walked over, examining the man with cold, calculating eyes. "This is him," he said, his voice unwavering. "This is the one who has been working against us, trying to tear us apart." The man, still bound and on his knees, glared at the chief, his face twisted with rage. "You have no idea what you've started," he spat, his voice dripping with contempt. "The forces behind me are more powerful than anything you could ever imagine." The chief leaned in, his voice low and dangerous. "I have lived through the worst the world has to offer. Your threats are empty." James felt a deep sense of satisfaction as the chief stood tall, unmoving in front of the man. The fight had been long, but with the enemy in their hands, the balance was tipping in favor of the Apache people. "What will you do with him?" James asked, his tone steady but tinged with curiosity. Nehemina, who had been standing close to her father, looked at James before answering. "We will not kill him. That is not our way," she said, her voice firm. "But we will make him understand the cost of his actions. He will be forced to walk with us, to witness the strength of our people. And perhaps, in time, he will see the truth." James nodded, understanding. The Apache people had always shown him a different way, a way of survival rooted in honor and justice, not revenge. The chief nodded in agreement, turning to his warriors. "Take him," he commanded. "Let him see the land he tried to take from us, and let him understand that this land will never fall." The warriors moved to restrain the man further, guiding him away from James and Nehemina. The prisoner, now powerless, threw one last defiant glare at them before he was led into the depths of the camp. Nehemina placed a hand on James' arm, her touch grounding him. "You have done more than I could have asked," she said quietly. "You have shown not just your strength, but your heart." James met her eyes, the bond between them undeniable. "I fight for what matters now," he said, his voice resolute. "For this land. For you." She smiled, a smile that spoke volumes of everything that had been built between them. The chief walked over to them, his presence commanding as always. "James," he said, his voice carrying the weight of years of leadership. "You are now more than just a man of the land. You are part of something larger. You have shown the strength of our people, and for that, we are grateful." James nodded, feeling a deep sense of belonging. He had not just fought for land or for a cause. He had fought for a future. As the night fell over the camp, the fire crackled, the warriors sat in a circle, their faces illuminated by the flames. The silence between them was peaceful, the kind that comes only after a hard-fought victory. The battle was not over. The war was far from finished. But tonight, there was a moment of peace, a moment where James knew that he had found his place among the Apache, fighting not just for survival, but for a future that was worth living for. Nehemina sat beside him, her hand resting on his, and for the first time since he had arrived, James felt as though he truly belonged. Together, they would face whatever challenges lay ahead. Together, they would fight for the land they loved and the people they had come to protect. The days that followed the capture of the traitor were filled with a somber quiet. The Apache camp had seen its fair share of battles, but this one felt different. The air was thick with anticipation, the warriors going about their tasks with the weight of the war still pressing on their minds. James had fulfilled his promise. He had hunted down the enemy, brought him to the chief, and helped ensure their survival for the time being. But the threat was not gone. Nehemina stayed by his side, her presence a constant reminder of what they had fought for. The bond between them had grown in ways neither of them had expected. The land, the people, and the future of the Apache all seemed to hinge on the decisions they made now. James had once been a man of isolation, content with the quiet life of a rancher, but now he had become something else, a protector, a leader, and a man willing to fight for something far greater than himself. He looked at Nehemia one evening as they sat by the fire, her eyes reflecting the flames, and he knew that this journey they had embarked on was far from over. "We've come so far," James said, his voice a little rough from days of tension. "But I know this is just the beginning. I can't help but feel like there's more to do." Nehemia nodded, her hand resting on his. "We've won many battles, James, but the fight for our future is not over. There are more challenges ahead, and not all of them will be as clear as the one we just faced." James understood. He had seen enough of the world now to know that peace was never permanent, especially in the Wild West. The fight for survival, for land, and for the protection of those you love was never truly over. But he also knew something else, that he had found something worth fighting for. "I'll stand by you," James said, his voice steady. "Whatever comes next, we'll face it together." Nehemia smiled softly, her hand gently squeezing his. "I knew you would," she said, her voice filled with quiet strength. "And I'll stand by you too." The chief approached them, his face stern yet filled with pride. "James," he said, his voice commanding yet respectful, "you have proven yourself. Your fight is our fight. But now we must look beyond the battles and plan for the future. The land we have fought to protect is more than just land. It is a symbol of our people, of who we are, and what we stand for. We cannot let it slip away again." James stood, meeting the chief's gaze. "What do we do now?" he asked. "We prepare," the chief replied. "We continue to strengthen our alliances, build our defenses, and ensure that our people are ready for whatever comes next. We will not be caught off guard again." James nodded, his resolve hardening. He had become part of something greater than himself, part of a people who fought not just for survival, but for the legacy they would leave behind. As the sun set that night, casting long shadows over the land, James and Nehemia stood together, their hands clasped. The world around them was uncertain, but in that moment, they knew they were not alone. They had each other, and they had the strength of the Apache people at their backs. Together, they would face whatever the future held. The battle had been won, but the war for their future was far from over. And James knew, without a doubt, that he would stand by Nehemia's side until the very end. They were no longer just two people fighting for survival. They were partners in a cause greater than anything they had ever imagined. And that, in the end, was all that mattered.